Imagine you're a Soviet engineer in the 1930s. Your boss walks in and asks, "What if we made a tank, but shaped like a giant hamster ball?" And here's the crazy part. You say yes. You actually build it. And for a brief moment in history, the military takes it seriously. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a joke. This is the story of the Soviet Sphere tank, a real military project that looks like someone combined a tank, a beach ball, and absolute madness. Today, you're going to learn about one of the strangest chapters in military history. We're talking about tanks that rolled instead of drove, crews that got dizzy just sitting inside, and engineers who genuinely believed they were inventing the future of warfare. And the wildest part? On paper, it actually made sense. To understand why anyone thought a sphere tank was a good idea, we need to go back to the early 20th century. The world had just witnessed World War I, the first war where tanks actually mattered. But here's the thing about early tanks. They were terrible. Slow, clunky, broke down constantly, and got stuck on anything more challenging than flat ground. Trenches? Forget about it. A steep hill? Good luck. A medium-sized rock? Congratulations, you're walking home. Traditional tanks had obvious weak spots, flat armor plates that created perfect targets, tracks that could be disabled with a well-placed shot, and corners where armor was thinner. Engineers knew this, and they hated it. So someone, and we'll get to who in a minute, had a thought experiment. What if we eliminated all the weak spots? What if there are no corners, no flat surfaces, no obvious targets? A sphere. A perfect sphere. Think about it. A sphere has no angles, meaning incoming shells would ricochet off at almost any angle. Physics was on your side. No corners meant no thin spots in the armor. Every point on the surface could be equally thick. A sphere could theoretically roll over obstacles that would stop a tracked vehicle dead. Trenches? Roll over them. Walls? Roll over them. Enemy morale. Crushed. Literally. The shape itself was harder to hit. While a traditional tank presents a big rectangular target, a sphere moving erratically would be a nightmare for enemy gunners. And here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just one crazy person's idea. Multiple engineers in multiple countries independently came to the same conclusion. The British considered it. The Germans sketched designs. But the Soviets? The Soviets actually built them. Because in the USSR during the 1930s, Stalin had one message for his engineers. Think bigger. Think different. And whatever you do, don't think small. So they didn't. But here's the problem with revolutionary ideas. Reality doesn't care how good they look on paper. All right, let's talk about the actual projects. Because these weren't just drawings in a notebook. These were real machines with real budgets and real humans who had to sit inside them. And trust me, what you're about to hear sounds like a rejected plotline from a sci-fi comedy. First up, imagine you're a Soviet soldier. You've trained on rifles, maybe driven a truck. Then your commander tells you, "Congratulations, comrade. You're now a hamster." The first serious sphere tank design was basically a giant wheel with a crew compartment inside. Picture a hamster wheel. But instead of a hamster, there's a guy with a machine gun who's probably regretting his life choices. The crew sat inside a suspended cabin that stayed upright while the outer shell rolled around them. In theory, the outer shell was supposed to be armor-plated, covered in weapons, and powered by an engine that would make the whole thing roll forward. Now, if you're thinking that sounds like a recipe for the worst case of motion sickness in military history, you're absolutely right. But we'll get to that. Here's how it was supposed to work. The crew would sit in the middle, controlling the direction and speed. Machine guns would be mounted on the outer shell, controlled from inside. Some designs even included a flamethrower, because apparently someone thought, you know what this disorienting death sphere needs? Fire. This particular design came from Alexei Dyrenkov, a Soviet inventor who, to his credit, was thinking outside the box. Or in this case, inside the sphere. They actually built a prototype. They actually tested it. And here's what happened. The thing rolled forward. That's the good news. The bad news? It rolled forward with all the grace of a drunk elephant. Steering was nearly impossible. The crew reported feeling dizzy within minutes. And the weapons? Let's just say accuracy was not the sphere tank's strong suit. Imagine trying to aim a machine gun while sitting inside a rolling ball. Now imagine your target is shooting back. Now imagine you've also had 3 shots of vodka, because that's basically what the disorientation felt like. Now, technically, the Tsar Tank wasn't a sphere. It was more like 2 enormous wheels with a tank body stretched between them. But it deserves a mention because it shows just how weird Soviet engineering could get. Picture this. 2 wheels, each 27 feet tall. That's almost 3 stories high. Between them, a gun platform. Behind them, a tiny steering wheel that honestly looked like it was included as a joke. The idea was that massive wheels could roll over anything. Trenches, walls, enemy fortifications, your commanding officer's patience. The designers genuinely believed bigger was better. The reality was that it got stuck. Immediately, in the dirt, on flat ground, during the very first test. The tiny back wheel, the one responsible for steering, dug into soft ground, and the entire machine became a very expensive, very embarrassing monument to overconfidence. Why am I telling you about this? Because it shows the mindset. Soviet engineers weren't afraid to try ideas that seemed insane. And the sphere tank was just the next evolution of that philosophy. If 2 giant wheels don't work, let's try one wheel that goes all the way around. But wait, it gets weirder. Because some engineers looked at the monowheel design and thought, this is good, but it's not sphere-wide enough. What if the entire thing was a ball? These designs eliminated the outer wheel concept entirely. Instead, the entire tank was a sphere, solid armor on the outside, crew and engine on the inside, and prayers holding the whole thing together. Some designs proposed using internal gyroscopes to keep the crew stable while the sphere rolled. Others suggested a system of weighted pendulums. One particularly ambitious design wanted to use the recoil from the guns to help propel the tank forward. Yes, you read that right. They wanted to use the gun as a propulsion system. Shoot forward, ball rolls backward. Shoot backward, ball rolls forward. Shoot sideways, and honestly, nobody thought that far ahead. And then, because apparently one sphere wasn't enough, someone proposed a 2-sphere design. 2 armored balls, connected by an axle, each with its own crew, working in coordination. On paper, this was revolutionary. 2 spheres meant better stability, more firepower, redundancy if one was disabled. In reality, this meant 2 crews getting dizzy simultaneously while trying to coordinate their movements and not accidentally shooting each other. According to reports, the few prototypes that were actually built faced a common problem. The crews couldn't function. The disorientation was so severe that gunners couldn't aim, drivers couldn't steer, and commanders couldn't command because they were too busy trying not to vomit. There's a reason modern astronauts go through zero-gravity training. These guys had rolling ball of death training, and surprisingly, try not to throw up on your comrade wasn't adequate preparation for combat. So here's the moment you've been waiting for. After all this engineering, all this testing, all this revolutionary thinking, did sphere tanks actually work? The short answer, no. The long answer, oh God, no, and here's why. Remember how I mentioned the crews got dizzy? That wasn't a minor inconvenience. That was a mission-critical failure. When you're inside a rolling sphere, your inner ear, the part of your body that handles balance, completely freaks out. You're moving, but your environment is also moving around you. It's like being seasick, carsick, and on a broken carnival ride all at once. Crews reported that within 5 minutes of operation, they experienced severe nausea, disorientation, and vertigo. Within 10 minutes, some couldn't tell which direction was up. Now imagine trying to identify enemy positions, aim weapons, and make tactical decisions while your brain is screaming, "Make it stop." Modern fighter pilots deal with G-forces and spatial disorientation. But they have training, specialized equipment, and most importantly, they're not literally rolling around inside a giant metal ball while people shoot at them. Steering a sphere tank was like trying to control a bowling ball using only good intentions and optimism. Traditional tanks have tracks. Independent control on each side means you can turn, reverse, pivot. It's intuitive. Sphere tanks had momentum and hope. The proposed control systems used a combination of weight shifting, engine power adjustment, and occasionally just leaning really hard in the direction you wanted to go. Some designs included braking systems, but stopping a multi-ton sphere that's actively rolling was about as easy as stopping a freight train with a polite request. Test reports described sphere tanks as having two speeds, barely moving and completely out of control. There was no middle ground. And turning? Forget about it. The best you could hope for was vaguely curving in a direction that might eventually point you toward the enemy. Here's a fun question. How do you aim a gun when your entire tank is spinning? Answer: you don't. You point in a general direction, say a prayer to whatever deity you believe in, and pull the trigger. Think about it. The tank is rolling. The turret is trying to stay oriented to the target. The crew is dizzy. The enemy is moving. And you're supposed to hit something? The accuracy of sphere tank weapons in tests was so bad that one report suggested they'd be more effective if the crew just opened a hatch and threw rocks. Remember how the whole point of a sphere was to roll over obstacles? Yeah, about that. It turns out that while a sphere theoretically can roll over things, it requires either a lot of speed, which meant the crew had no control, or a gentle slope, which meant it wasn't actually better than regular tanks. Trenches? The sphere would roll into them and get stuck at the bottom, sitting there like a very embarrassed beach ball. Walls? Unless the sphere had a running start, it would just roll up, lose momentum, and roll back down, sometimes over friendly troops. Roue terrain? Every bump and rock sent the crew bouncing around inside like socks in a dryer. Here's the thing nobody anticipated. While the sphere shape did help deflect some shots, it created a new problem. When a shell hit a traditional tank and deflected, it deflected away. When a shell hit a sphere and deflected, it ricocheted at unpredictable angles, sometimes into friendly forces nearby. Plus, if the sphere got disabled, engine failure, stuck in mud, crew too dizzy to function, you had a giant metal ball full of soldiers who couldn't escape quickly. The hatches were designed to stay closed during rolling. Opening one while the tank was moving meant you'd probably get crushed. So did sphere tanks work? Technically, they rolled. They moved forward. Occasionally, they even went in the intended direction. But as weapons of war? As practical military vehicles? As anything other than extremely expensive ways to make soldiers motion sick? No, they were actually more dangerous to their own crews than to the enemy. The sphere tank failed not because the idea was stupid. It failed because reality doesn't care how clever your engineering is. It only cares what works. So if these things were such disasters, why did it take so long for the military to say, yeah, let's not do this? Good question. Let's talk about why the sphere tank program finally died. Here's what militaries care about. Will this work when I need it? Will it work tomorrow? Will it work in mud, snow, heat, and under fire? The answer with sphere tanks was maybe, sometimes, if we're lucky and the crew has strong stomachs. Meanwhile, traditional tanks were getting better. Better engines, better armor, better weapons. They were reliable. They were proven. They did what they were supposed to do. The military had a choice. Invest in a technology that worked pretty well, or invest in a technology that made crews vomit while occasionally rolling in the right direction. It wasn't a hard choice. Sphere tanks were expensive, really expensive. The curved armor had to be specially manufactured. The internal stabilization systems were complex. The training program would have been a nightmare. For the cost of one sphere tank, you could build 3 or 4 traditional tanks. And those traditional tanks wouldn't make their crews dizzy. Think about the logistics of sphere tanks. How do you transport them? How do you repair them in the field? How do you refuel them? How do you train crews when everyone who tries it gets motion sick? Traditional tanks used existing infrastructure. Sphere tanks would have required an entirely new support system. New tools, new parts, new training facilities, new everything. The military looked at this and said, or we could just make normal tanks better. By the time sphere tanks were being seriously considered, traditional tank design was advancing rapidly. Sloped armor, which provided similar ricochet advantages without the whole rolling death ball problem, became standard. Improved suspension systems meant tanks could handle rough terrain better. Better engines meant more speed and maneuverability. The sphere tank's advantages were being replicated by conventional designs. without any of the disadvantages. The Soviet military officially abandoned Sphere tank development in the late 1930s. The projects were classified, the prototypes were quietly scrapped, and everyone agreed to never speak of this again. Well, until the internet found out about it. And now it's a meme. But here's the thing. The military didn't reject Sphere tanks because they were a dumb idea. They rejected them because they were an impractical idea. There's a difference. A dumb idea is, let's make tanks out of cardboard. An impractical idea is, let's make tanks spherical, but we haven't solved the crew disorientation problem yet. The Sphere tank failed not because of stupidity, but because of reality. Okay, we've spent half an hour talking about how Sphere tanks didn't work. But here's the thing. I think Sphere tanks are actually awesome. Not because they worked, but because someone tried. Think about the environment that allowed Sphere tanks to exist. We're talking about 1930s Soviet Union, not exactly known for encouraging creative thinking. And yet, engineers were given the freedom to say, what if we completely rethought what a tank is? And their superiors said, okay, let's find out. That's remarkable. In most military organizations, suggesting a radical departure from existing designs gets you laughed out of the room. But in the Soviet experimental weapons programs, it got you a budget and a workshop. These engineers genuinely believed they were inventing the future. They did the math. They ran the physics simulations. Well, the 1930s equivalent, which was probably a lot of blackboards and arguments. They identified real problems with existing tank designs and proposed a radical solution. That takes guts. And they didn't just draw pictures. They built actual prototypes. They tested them. They collected data. They tried to make it work. It didn't work, but they tried. And that's worth respecting. Today, we look at Sphere tanks and laugh. They're absurd. They're impractical. They're perfect meme material. But back then, they represented something important. The idea that maybe we could do things differently. That the future might not look like the past. That innovation meant taking risks. The history of technology is full of failed experiments. Flying cars, personal jetpacks, underwater cities. Most future technology never works out. But we keep trying. Because sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the crazy idea actually works. Sphere tanks tell us something about their era. This was a time when people genuinely believed science and engineering could solve any problem. Make warfare more efficient? Sure. Eliminate all the weaknesses of existing technology? Why not? It was naive. It was optimistic. And it was doomed to fail. But there's something beautiful about that kind of ambition. We do the same thing today. We propose hyperloops and Mars colonies and AI that will solve all our problems. Most of it won't work. Some of it will be laughable in hindsight. But we try anyway, because that's what humans do. We see a problem, we imagine a solution, and we build it, even if the solution is a giant rolling ball with guns on it. So that's the story of Soviet Sphere tanks. They didn't work. They couldn't work. But for a brief moment in history, someone believed they could. And Sphere tanks aren't alone. Military history is full of bizarre experiments. The Nazis tried to build a sun gun, a giant orbital mirror to burn enemy cities. The Americans tested a bat bomb, literally thousands of bats with tiny incendiary devices strapped to them. Some of these ideas make Sphere tanks look reasonable. What all these projects have in common is this. Someone looked at a problem and thought, what if we tried something completely different? Most of the time, it didn't work. But occasionally, very occasionally, it did. And that's why militaries keep funding weird experiments. Sphere tanks represent a specific moment in history. A moment when engineering ambition outpaced practical reality. When the desire to innovate exceeded the ability to implement. We can laugh at them now. But the engineers who built them weren't idiots. They were dreamers. They were people who looked at the impossible and said, let's try anyway. And honestly, the world needs more of that. More people willing to try the impossible. More experiments that might fail. More giant rolling death balls full of dizzy soldiers. Okay, maybe not that last one. Military history is full of stories like this. Weapons that seemed brilliant on paper, but catastrophic in reality. Technologies that promised to change warfare forever, but but couldn't get past the prototype stage. And sometimes, these failed experiments tell us more about human nature than the successful ones do. They show us what we dare to imagine, or willing to try, and what we learn when we fail. The Soviet Sphere tank didn't change the world, but it showed us something important, that sometimes the craziest ideas are worth trying. Even if the result is a bunch of motion-sick soldiers rolling around in a metal ball, wondering why they didn't just stick with regular tanks. Thanks for watching. And remember, just because something didn't work doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. Unless it's a sphere tank. Those definitely weren't worth doing.